Storms moving into the U.S. Northeast have triggered another controversy involving migrants.
The New York City administration was forced to evacuate nearly 2,000 migrants. The migrants were evacuated to a high school in Brooklyn on Tuesday night. A combination of snow, rain and strong winds prompted New York City Mayor to clear out the sprawling tent complex. Some areas were hit with heavy snow last weekend, increasing the risk of significant flooding.
Earlier, migrants were being housed at the Floyd Bennett Field. Floyd Bennett Field was a former airport in Brooklyn. Migrants were seen collecting their personal belongings before being transported to the nearby James Madison High School. Now, an aide to the mayor pointed to predicted wind speeds of more than 70 miles per hour as a major cause for concern. Adams' administration has erected the temporary shelter at the airfield in response to the waves of new immigrants arriving in the city.
And to get us more details on the situation, we earlier spoke to our correspondent Susan Teherani, who tells us about the transfer of the migrants from the high school to the high school in Brooklyn.
As torrential rains and strong winds were expected for Tuesday evening here in New York, students at a Brooklyn high school learned that they would have to study remote on Wednesday because some 2,000 migrants would be using their high school's gymnasium as a shelter. The city moved them from an abandoned airfield that it had set up called Fort Bennett Field to this high school for precaution against those storms. Ultimately, many of the parents in protest gathered outside of that high school in Brooklyn, saying why their children's education had to be compromised because the city didn't have proper plans in place. And then on Wednesday, while those migrants returned to their shelter, there was a protest once again by parents and local officials, basically saying that on the one hand, these migrant families, many of them with children, had to sleep on the floor in these gymnasiums. On the other hand, students weren't allowed to go to school. And then it was later learned that they also, while staying home and studying online, didn't actually have a teacher. They just had to log on to a Google document. And then later on Wednesday, we learned that a school dance, which had been planned months in advance, was canceled as well. Hardly an ideal situation for anyone. Many here in New York are blaming local and state officials for their mismanagement regarding this situation, saying that they have no one to blame but themselves. Now, moving forward, it's not clear what will happen to those 2,000 migrants in Fort Bennett Field if there is another storm or weather conditions won't permit them from staying there at their shelter.
Susan also shared insights on migrants who have been living in New York City shelters who were evicted on Tuesday. Listen to this.
I'm standing in front of the Roosevelt Hotel, which has become a migrant processing center in recent months, a sort of first stop for migrants when they arrive here in New York. On Tuesday, the city began to evict migrants staying in shelters for free if they reach their 60-day limit. Now, the city also says that if migrants, notably those with children, want to reapply for city shelters, whether it's in hotels or these makeshift camps or elsewhere, they would have to come back here to the Roosevelt Hotel and be processed once again. New York says that it is overwhelmed with the number of migrants across the city. In fiscal year 2023 alone, the city spent $1.43 billion on migrants, and by 2025, that number is expected to rise to $12 billion.